In a small, quiet town, the kind where everybody knows your name, an unsettling tension brewed just beneath the surface. It was the kind of place where things hadn't changed much in years. People were set in their ways, and traditions, both good and bad, lingered. It was the perfect spot for a man like Carl to settle into his routine after coming back from war. Carl was a proud veteran, a man who had seen more of the world than most folks in this town ever would. He had fought for his country, served with honor, and now, all he wanted was a peaceful life. But life had a way of throwing unexpected challenges his way. Carl's tall, broad frame carried an air of quiet strength. His face was weathered, lines etched from years of service, but his eyes held a warmth that contrasted the harsh experiences behind them. Despite everything, he was a humble man, never one to demand attention. He believed in treating everyone with respect, no matter their background. That's why, when he walked into the restaurant that day, he didn't expect much. Just a meal and a quiet moment to himself. The restaurant was one of the most popular in town, but not for all the right reasons. The owner, Mr. Walker, was known for running his business with a firm hand, and an attitude that was stuck in the past. If you were someone he didn't like the look of, you'd know it immediately. It didn't matter who you were or what you'd done, and Carl, being a black man, unfortunately fell into that category. As Carl walked through the door, the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle, but he could feel eyes on him, a few whispers from the back. He wasn't surprised. It wasn't the first time he'd felt this kind of discomfort in his own country. Carl made his way to the counter, still holding his head high, refusing to let anyone's prejudice shake him. "Can I get a table, please?" he asked the hostess politely. The young woman, clearly uncomfortable, glanced toward the back of the room where Mr. Walker stood, arms crossed, glaring in Carl's direction. She hesitated, then quietly pointed toward a corner table near the kitchen. Carl nodded and walked over, ignoring the growing tension. He sat down, took a deep breath, and waited. The minutes passed, and the waitstaff seemed to be avoiding his table entirely. The few other patrons in the restaurant began casting sideways glances, some chuckling under their breath. Carl, still patient, signaled for service. No one came. He didn't want to make a scene, but it was becoming clear what was happening. Finally, Mr. Walker walked over, wiping his hands on a towel as if he'd been working hard in the kitchen. He stood by Carl's table, looking him up and down, his expression filled with disdain. "Can I help you with something?" Walker said, his voice cold. "I'd just like to order," Carl replied, keeping his tone steady. Walker snorted. "We don't serve your kind here." The words hit like a punch, but Carl, used to this kind of blatant disrespect, held his ground. "My kind. I'm just here to eat, like everyone else." Walker leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I know who you are. Think you can walk in here and expect special treatment just 'cause you're some big-shot soldier? Not here, pal. Not in my restaurant." Carl's fists clenched under the table, but he kept his composure. "I didn't come here for special treatment. Just to eat, like anyone else." Walker's face twisted into a sneer. "You want food? You can go eat somewhere else. You're not welcome here." Carl stood up slowly, towering over the restaurant owner. The whole room fell silent, every eye on them. For a moment, it looked like something was about to happen, the kind of thing that would end with police sirens and headlines in the local paper. But Carl took a step back, refusing to give Walker the satisfaction of losing his temper. "You're making a mistake," Carl said quietly, "a big one." Walker smirked, clearly enjoying his small victory. "The only mistake would be letting someone like you sit here." Carl shook his head, turned, and walked out of the restaurant, his pride still intact, but the sting of humiliation clear. The door slammed behind him, and the murmur of voices picked up again inside. But what Walker didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Carl wasn't just a veteran, he wasn't just any man. And while he might have walked out of that restaurant without causing a scene, the story was far from over. Carl had a son, one Walker would soon wish he'd never crossed. Outside, Carl pulled out his phone, dialing a number with a calmness that belied the anger simmering just beneath the surface. His son, Derek, answered on the other end. Derek, a man who had made quite a name for himself in the business world, was not someone to be underestimated. He was powerful, influential, and fiercely protective of his father. "Hey, Dad." Derek's voice came through the phone. Everything okay? Carl took a deep breath before answering. We need to talk. There was a pause, and Derek's tone shifted, sensing something wasn't right. Where are you? Derek asked, his voice now serious. Carl told him everything: the restaurant, the humiliation, the racist remarks from Walker. Derek didn't say much at first, but Carl could hear the anger building on the other end of the line. Don't worry about it, Derek finally said, his voice calm but filled with determination. I'll handle it. Carl knew his son well enough to understand that when Derek said he'd handle something, he meant it. And it wasn't going to be pretty for anyone who stood in his way. Back in the restaurant, Mr. Walker continued his day as if nothing had happened, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. He had no idea who Carl's son was or the kind of power he wielded. But he was about to find out. As the sun began to set over the small town, Carl stood by his truck, staring back at the restaurant, wondering how far things would go. He trusted Derek, but he also knew that once his son got involved, there was no turning back. What Carl didn't realize was just how far Derek was willing to go to right this wrong. And by the time Mr. Walker found out, it would be too late to fix the damage he caused. As Carl drove home, the quiet of the small town seemed louder than usual. His mind wandered back to all the moments in his life where he had been judged, not for his actions, but for his skin color. He faced it growing up, even before he put on the uniform and fought for a country that didn't always fight for him. And yet, after all these years, it still stung just the same. He thought about Mr. Walker's face, the way the man had spoken to him with such ease, like it was second nature. Carl knew men like that. They wore their prejudice like a second skin, and they never expected any consequences for it. But this time, Carl knew things were different. He wasn't alone in this. His son, Derek, was a different breed. Derek had built himself up from the ground, earned respect in rooms where people like Walker wouldn't even be allowed to clean the floors. Carl parked in front of his modest home, the familiar sight calming his racing thoughts. The quiet street was lined with houses, lights glowing in the windows as families settled in for the evening. He sat there for a moment, the weight of the day heavy on his shoulders. Derek would call him soon. He'd always followed through on his word, but Carl couldn't shake the feeling that this situation was going to spiral in ways he couldn't control. Inside the house, the memories of Carl's late wife filled every corner. The photos on the wall, the scent of her favorite candles still lingering in the air. She had always been his anchor. She would have known how to handle this, would have reminded him to keep his head up and focus on what really mattered. But Carl was on his own now, at least in that sense. The world had changed since she passed, and Carl wasn't sure if it was for better or worse. As Carl sat down at the kitchen table, his phone buzzed again. It was Derek. I'm coming into town tomorrow, Derek said, without any preamble. Carl could hear the edge in his son's voice, the kind of calm that only came before a storm. Son, listen, I don't want this to turn into something bigger than it needs to be. Carl started, but Derek cut him off. Dad, this is already bigger than it needs to be. That man disrespected you, and he thinks he can get away with it because people let him. Not this time. Carl sighed. He knew there was no changing Derek's mind once it was set. His son had always been strong-willed, ever since he was a kid. When Derek saw an injustice, he wouldn't let it slide, not if he had the power to change it. And in this case, Derek had more power than most people knew. After hanging up the phone, Carl sat in silence. He had raised Derek to stand up for what was right, to never let anyone push him down. But Carl also knew that in towns like this, the wrong kind of attention could bring trouble, and the last thing he wanted was for Derek to get caught up in something ugly. The next day came quickly, and as the morning light streamed through the windows, Carl found himself pacing the living room. He glanced out the window, waiting for Derek's arrival. It wasn't long before he heard the hum of a sleek, black car pulling up outside. Derek stepped out, dressed sharply, his presence commanding the space around him. People who didn't know Derek often underestimated him. He had a quiet intensity, the kind that made people take notice without him having to say a word. Dad, Derek said as he walked up the driveway, his eyes scanning the neighborhood as if assessing the situation. Son, Carl replied, feeling a mix of pride and concern. You didn't have to come all the way down here for this. Derek's gaze softened as he looked at his father. Yes, I did. You've done enough letting people get away with treating you like you don't matter. Not anymore. Carl nodded, knowing it was pointless to argue. He had raised his son to be strong, but now that strength was out of his control. Together, they climbed into Derek's car, and without needing to say a word, they both knew where they were headed. The drive to the restaurant felt longer than it was, the tension thick between them. Carl stared out the window, lost in thought. He didn't want revenge, not really. What he wanted was simple, respect. But he also knew Derek's way of handling things was different, more direct, more forceful. And a part of Carl wondered if maybe that was what this town needed, a shake-up, a reminder that the old ways wouldn't last forever. When they pulled up in front of the restaurant, it was just opening for the day. A few locals were already gathered inside, sipping coffee and chatting like any other morning. Derek stepped out first, his movements deliberate. Carl followed, feeling eyes on them from the moment they walked in. Mr. Walker was at the counter, talking to one of the waitresses, when he saw Carl walk back through the door. His expression turned sour immediately, but it shifted when he noticed Derek by his side. He didn't recognize Derek, not at first, but Carl could see the wheels turning in Walker's head, trying to place the face. "You're back," Walker said, his voice dripping with the same arrogance as the day before. "I thought I made it clear." "You didn't make anything clear," Derek interrupted, his voice calm but with an authority that silenced the room. "But I'm about to." Walker frowned, clearly taken aback by Derek's confidence. "And who do you think you are?" Derek stepped forward, fixing Walker with a cold stare. "The man who's going to make sure this place gets the respect it should have given my father. You didn't know who you were dealing with yesterday. You're about to find out." Carl watched as the color drained from Walker's face. Derek didn't need to say much more. His reputation, his connections, his ability to make things happen spoke louder than words. Carl felt a strange sense of satisfaction watching the tables turn, but he also knew this was just the beginning. Walker had no idea what was coming next, and neither did Carl. The silence in the restaurant felt thick, almost suffocating. Every eye was on Derek and Mr. Walker, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Carl stood by, uneasy. This wasn't what he wanted, a public confrontation, but it was out of his hands now. Derek had taken charge, and Carl could only hope his son's approach wouldn't lead to something neither of them could control. Mr. Walker, usually so smug and in command of his little corner of the world, seemed rattled. His gaze flickered nervously between Derek and Carl, trying to figure out just how much trouble he was really in. The other patrons were quiet, sensing the shift in power. But instead of backing down, Walker doubled down, something dark flashing in his eyes. "You think you can waltz in here and make demands? Just because you wear a nice suit and throw around some big words?" Walker spat, his voice rising, the bravado returning. "This is my restaurant, my town. You don't scare me." Derek didn't flinch. He simply leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper, but with enough force to make the hairs on the back of Walker's neck stand up. "I'm not here to scare you, but I promise you wish I had." Walker's face twisted in anger, but before he could respond, the door to the restaurant swung open with a loud bang. Everyone turned to see who had come in. A group of men, locals, strode in with an air of familiarity. They were regulars, the kind of men who spent their days in the town and their nights at this very restaurant. One of them, a burly man with a worn baseball cap, nodded toward Walker. "Everything all right here, Jim?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he looked over at Derek and Carl. Carl's heart sank. He recognized these men. They were part of the old guard of the town, men who had never made any secret of their disdain for people like him. Derek, however, seemed unfazed. In fact, a small, knowing smile crossed his lips. "Seems like we got a problem," the man in the cap said, stepping closer to Derek, clearly trying to intimidate him. "This here is a local establishment. Maybe you and your daddy should find somewhere else to eat." Carl's chest tightened. This was escalating fast, faster than he'd expected. He had dealt with men like this before, back in the day. They didn't back down, and they didn't care who got hurt. But Derek still wasn't rattled. In fact, he stepped right up to the man in the cap, unbothered by the looming threat. "Maybe you don't understand," Derek said, his voice cool. "This isn't just about where we eat. This is about respect. And if you're smart, you'll step aside before you get yourself into something you can't handle." The man in the cap glared at Derek, his jaw tightening. fists clenched at his sides. The tension in the room was unbearable. Carl could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a deep sense of dread. But before things could spiral out of control, something unexpected happened. The sound of tires screeching to a halt outside broke the standoff. Everyone turned toward the windows as two black SUVs pulled up in front of the restaurant. Derek's calm expression didn't waver, but Carl's eyes widened in surprise. He hadn't expected this. Not now. From the SUVs, several men in suits stepped out, their movements precise and deliberate. They walked into the restaurant like they owned the place, each one carrying an air of authority that couldn't be ignored. The lead man, tall and imposing, approached Derek with a nod. "Everything in order, Mr. Johnson?" the man asked, his voice steady but respectful. Derek glanced around the room, his expression unchanged. "For now," he replied, his tone casual. Carl realized then what was happening. Derek had called in reinforcements. These men weren't just anyone. They were security, the kind Derek used in his business dealings. High level, professional, and not the type to back down from a threat. It was clear now that this was more than just a father-son visit. Derek had anticipated trouble, and he had come prepared. Walker's face drained of color as he watched the men file in, their mere presence enough to send a chill through the room. The regulars, including the man in the cap, looked uneasy now, their earlier confidence wavering. "I told you," Derek said, his voice quiet but powerful. "You're in over your head." Walker stammered, clearly at a loss for words. The bravado that had fueled him moments ago was crumbling under the weight of what was happening. He knew that Derek wasn't just some angry customer. He was someone who could, and would, turn his world upside down. But just when it seemed like Derek had full control of the situation, a voice broke through the tension, catching everyone off guard. "Hold on," a woman called out from the back of the restaurant. She emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes sharp and focused. It was Mrs. Walker, the co-owner of the restaurant and someone who had kept mostly to the background over the years. But now, it seemed she had something to say. She walked straight up to Carl, ignoring the tension between the other men. "Mr. Johnson," she said quietly, addressing Carl with a formality that surprised him. "I think we need to have a word." Carl blinked, unsure of where this was going. Mrs. Walker was usually silent, a shadow in her husband's louder, more abrasive presence. But now, she was standing in the middle of the storm, her eyes meeting Carl's with something that looked like regret. "Jim's a fool," she said softly, glancing over at her husband, who looked bewildered. "But he doesn't speak for everyone in this town. Not anymore." Carl studied her, unsure if he could trust her words. Was this another trick? Another way to pacify him without real change? Derek, sensing the shift in the room, stepped forward. "What are you saying?" Mrs. Walker's gaze shifted to Derek, and for the first time, there was no fear in her eyes. "I'm saying there's more to this than you realize. More history here than you know. And if you really want to understand what's happening, you'll have to hear the full story." Carl exchanged a look with Derek, unsure of what to think. Could there be something deeper going on? Something that went beyond just the surface-level racism they'd encountered? The men in the room, sensing the tension break slightly, backed off, watching closely as Mrs. Walker stood her ground. Derek's security detail remained on alert, but even they seemed unsure of what to do next. And in that moment, Carl knew the stakes had just been raised. This wasn't just about a racist restaurant owner. There was something else lurking beneath the surface, something that Mrs. Walker seemed ready to reveal. But Carl wasn't sure if he was ready to hear it. Carl stared at Mrs. Walker, feeling the weight of her words. There was something behind her eyes, something she'd been holding back for years. It made him uneasy. He had come here expecting a confrontation, maybe a resolution to the open disrespect, but now it seemed like they were peeling back layers of something much darker, something that had been festering in this town for a long time. Mrs. Walker glanced nervously at her husband, who looked confused and angry. "Jim, you don't even know half of it," she said, her voice soft but steady. She turned back to Carl, her expression more serious. "You've probably heard stories about this place, stories about why certain people aren't welcome here. But those stories, they're only half the truth." Carl frowned, unsure of where she was going with this. Derek shifted beside him, his sharp eyes never leaving Mrs. Walker. The men in suits, Derek's security, stood ready, though the tension in the room had shifted from physical danger to something more personal, more complicated. "You see," she continued, "my father owned this place before Jim and I took over. He ran it the same way, kept certain people out. Not because he hated them, but because of something that happened a long time ago." She took a deep breath. He was trying to protect his own secret. Carl felt a chill creep down his spine. Secret? Mrs. Walker nodded. "Your family wasn't the first to be humiliated here. A long time ago, my father did the same to someone else. But it wasn't just any man. It was someone he owed everything to, someone who saved his life during the war." Carl's breath caught in his throat. He glanced at Derek, who seemed just as stunned. "What are you talking about?" Carl asked, his voice quieter now, wary of what was coming next. Mrs. Walker looked directly into Carl's eyes, her gaze unwavering. "Your father, Carl. My father never told anyone, but it was your father who saved him during the war. He was a soldier, just like you, and my father never could face that debt. He was ashamed. Ashamed that a black man had saved him when the rest of his world told him that wasn't supposed to happen. So, he built this restaurant, built his reputation, and made sure to keep people like your father out. It was his way of holding on to the power he felt he'd lost." The words hit Carl like a punch. His father, the man he had always admired, who had served with honor, had been part of a story Carl never knew. The humiliation Carl felt walking into that restaurant was part of something that stretched back further than he could have imagined. And all of it was built on a lie of fear, of pride, and of shame. Derek stepped forward, his voice sharp. "So you're telling us that all of this, the disrespect, the hatred, is because your father couldn't live with the fact that someone different from him saved his life?" Mrs. Walker nodded, her face full of regret. "Yes, and Jim, he just carried on what my father started, without even knowing the full story. He thought it was about keeping control, but it's not about power. It's about shame." Jim Walker looked furious, his face red with embarrassment. "Is this true?" he demanded, looking at his wife. "You never told me any of this." Mrs. Walker nodded again, her eyes full of sadness. "I didn't tell you because I didn't know how. I didn't know how to face the truth myself. But seeing Carl here today, seeing the same thing happen again, I couldn't stay silent any longer." Carl stood there, numb. He felt a rush of emotions, anger mixing with disbelief. His father had been a hero, but the weight of that had been buried under generations of hate and shame. And now, standing in this place, in this restaurant that had always felt like enemy territory, Carl realized just how deep the scars of history ran. Derek, always quick to act, turned to Jim, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "So what now? You've spent your life carrying out someone else's hate, and for what? You've disrespected my father, you've disrespected his legacy. You can't erase the truth." Jim Walker opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked completely lost, torn between his wife's confession and the reality he had built for himself. It was clear he didn't know how to process what he was hearing. Carl stepped forward, his voice quiet but full of resolve. "My father never asked for anything in return for what he did. He fought because it was the right thing to do. And I'm not asking for anything either." He glanced at Derek, then back to Jim. "But this ends today. No more hate, no more shame." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of the past hanging heavy in the air. And then, to everyone's surprise, Jim Walker did something no one expected. He slowly nodded, his face pale, and stepped back from the counter. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know any of this, but he trailed off, clearly struggling to find the right words. "I'm sorry." It wasn't much, but it was enough for Carl. He didn't need a grand apology. He didn't need a public declaration. What mattered was that the truth had finally come out, and with it, the chance for real change. This town, this restaurant, it didn't have to be a place of division anymore. As Derek and Carl turned to leave, Mrs. Walker called out one last time. "Carl, your father's memory deserves better than what this place became. I can't change the past, but I can make sure it never happens again." Carl paused at the door, looking back at her. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement that while the pain of the past couldn't be erased, there was always room for hope, for something better. But as they stepped outside into the cool air, the final twist came not from the restaurant but from the town itself. Standing across the street, watching the whole scene unfold, was the mayor, an old family friend of Jim Walker's. Carl had seen him at town events, never suspecting that he, too, played a role in keeping the town divided. Derek saw it too, and for the first time that day, a real smile tugged at his lips. "Looks like we're not done yet, Dad." Carl followed his son's gaze and understood immediately. This wasn't over. The battle they had fought today was just the beginning. The town, the system, it all needed to change, and they were the ones who would see it through. As they walked toward their car, the sun setting on the horizon, Carl felt a strange sense of peace. His father's story had finally been told, and now it was time to write the next chapter. Carl and Derek walked slowly toward their car, the weight of everything that had happened settling in. The air outside felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a long-buried truth had finally been released. Carl glanced back at the restaurant, its neon sign flickering in the twilight. The place looked the same, but he knew it would never feel the same again, not for him, not for Derek, and not for anyone in that town. As they reached the car, Carl leaned against it, taking a deep breath. He hadn't realized how much tension he'd been carrying until now. The years of quiet anger, the unspoken hurt, all of it seemed to ease as he stood there beside his son. The confrontation had been more than he expected, but it also gave him something he hadn't anticipated. Closure. He had faced the past, the history that had haunted him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace with it. Derek, always the one with a plan, leaned next to him, arms crossed. "You know, this isn't just about one restaurant. This town, it's got deep roots in that kind of thinking. Today was just a start." Carl nodded. "I know." He looked over at Derek, feeling a surge of pride for his son. Derek hadn't just stood up for him today, he had stood up for something much bigger. "You've always been one step ahead, haven't you?" Derek smiled, a rare moment of softness between them. Learned from the best. The mater, still standing across the street, watched them, his face unreadable. Carl had known the man for years but never suspected he might be part of the problem. It was clear now that things were more complicated than he had ever realized. The restaurant was just one piece of a larger puzzle, a system that had quietly maintained the divisions that had hurt families like his for generations. And now, after today, that system had been exposed. Carl knew what they had to do next. It wasn't just about confronting one man's hatred. It was about changing the way the whole town operated, making sure that no one else had to endure what he and his family had. There were people in that town who would resist, people who were comfortable with the way things were, but there were also those who, like Mrs. Walker, were ready for change. That was where the real work would begin. "Do you think they'll let it go?" Carl asked, motioning toward the restaurant. "Or do you think Jim's going to fight it?" Derek shrugged. "Doesn't matter. If he fights it, we'll fight harder. If he doesn't, we'll make sure this place becomes something different, something better." Carl smiled. He liked the sound of that. There was no longer any need for quiet acceptance or trying to keep the peace at the expense of dignity. They had earned their right to be heard, and now they had the chance to shape the future. Not just for themselves, but for everyone who came after. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street, Carl looked out over the town he had called home for so long. It wasn't perfect, and it had its scars, but it was still his. And now, thanks to Derek's determination and his own newfound strength, he knew they had the power to heal some of those wounds. They got into the car, the engine rumbling to life. Carl took one last look at the restaurant, knowing that whatever happened next, it wouldn't define him anymore. It wouldn't define his father's legacy or Derek's future. They were moving forward, and nothing could stop that now. As they pulled away, Carl thought about the stories he would tell his grandchildren one day, stories about their family's resilience, about standing up for what was right, about never letting the past dictate who they were or who they could become. And maybe, just maybe, he'd tell them about the day they walked into a small-town restaurant and changed everything. In the rearview mirror, the town grew smaller, but Carl felt something grow inside him, something that had been dormant for too long. Hope. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, he believed it would be better. The drive back home was quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet. Derek glanced over at his father and smiled softly. Carl returned the smile, knowing that, no matter what happened next, they were in this together. and that, Carl realized, was all that really mattered.